Hello, my name is Dan Petrell. Again, I am with Maryland Realtors. I am the Director of Communications, and I'm really not that important here today. What's important is who is important, I can't even speak today, is Bill Castelli, our Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, and Susan Mitchell, our Director of Government Affairs. And they are going to be talking today on the upcoming legislative session, which begins today. And please put your questions in the questions and answer field, and then the Q&A box. And at certain points in time, Bill or Susan will ask me to read any questions, and I will supply them as such. So thank you all for your attendance. Enjoy today's webinar, and Happy New Year to you all.
Thank you, Dan. And again, Happy New Year to everybody who's joining us today. As Dan said, this is the first day of the Maryland legislative session. So it's technically the 442nd legislative session that Maryland has had. And Maryland has a 90-day legislative session. So starts today, goes through the first part of April, we think. And the reason I say we think is because, we now live in this COVID world, and it's really not clear, if some of the legislators get sick, if the virus starts to spread a little, session could end early the way it ended last year. But it's, the plan right now that the legislature has is to move forward for a full 90-day session. So what we're going to do today is cover some of the issues that we're going to bring before the legislature this year. We're going to cover some of the other issues that other folks are going to bring before the legislature that are real estate related, give you a sense of what those issues might look like, tell you a little bit about how we do our job. And what I mean by that, rather than telling you how we go down and lobby a bill, is really, how does a realtor organization like ours take a position on a bill? And cover a little bit why, it's important for us to track legislation. Susan, you can give some examples of, previous state bills that the legislature has followed that, really would have impacted our industry pretty significantly. The state legislature covers obviously all the licensing issues. So anything that's connected to what you do with your license, that is likely to be a state regulation that is derived probably from a state law. Tax policy, lots of tax policy, environmental policy, which could cover, what you can and can't do with a septic system, and things that you can and can't do with your property and selling property. Lots of landlord-tenant issues, and we're going to see a ton of landlord-tenant issues this year. So maybe Susan, can you give them a couple of examples of I call it the dirty dozen, but some of the worst bills that we've seen so far. And that's not this year, this is over time, but it gives you a pretty good idea of why it's important that we have volunteer realtors like we do looking at these bills.
Absolutely. Thank you. And hi, everybody. I'm Susan Mitchell, again, Director of Government Affairs. And what Bill's referring to, a lot of you are familiar, some of the past bills, the exclusive right to sell contract, which was basically the basis of our MLS system. There was legislation trying to make it illegal. 90-day limits were placed on all brokerage agreements. Additionally, one new and dear, close in our memory, was the real estate services sales tax from last year. You recall 3 days prior to our state of emergency, we had 600 realtor members turn out to oppose the professional services tax, which actually had been introduced late in the session. Those are just a few. A lot of folks, our staff go up throughout the state explaining a lot of the legislation that we support and oppose and how it's important that you all stay tuned into it.
Yeah, and This year legislative session is going to look a lot different. There will be no in-person activity. In a typical legislative session, Susan and I would be going down to the legislature. We would attend a hearing in person. There are days before the legislature that we might have, 15 bill hearings up, and we may not be testifying at each of those bills. Some of the times we're just dropping off a position statement. But none of that in-person activity is going to occur. In fact, the only kind of in-person activity that's going to be allowed is that if you make an appointment with a legislator, you'd be able to be escorted into the building directly to their office and then escorted directly out of the building after that. So no loitering around in the buildings. But for most people and most lobbyists, it doesn't really make sense to do that. It's probably going to be a lot of this, a lot of Zooming, a lot of telephone calls and text and emails. That's on the downside. On the positive side, especially for you as the public, you're going to get access to more things going on at the General Assembly than you have ever had. You will be able to not only see the bill hearings, which you could have previously done, you'll actually be able to see the floor sessions. You'll be able to see some of the subcommittee meetings. You'll be able to see the committee votes on bills, which has never been made public, at least in public communication. So all of that is going to be accessible by not just us, but by any members of the public. So in many ways, if you're not a lobbyist, this is going to be a more transparent system than they've had in many years. But as we look at the legislative session moving forward, the way we approach all of this, I mean, in a typical year, the legislature might consider somewhere between 2,500 or 3,500 bills. And we try to go through those bills and bring a number before a legislative committee. And maybe Susan, you can talk a little bit about what that process looks like. It's all volunteer Realtor members from across the state who serve on our legislative committee.
Absolutely. And with what Bill said, as far as all this exciting stuff available via Zoom now, say bye-bye to Netflix, you'll be tuning in. So our Ledge Committee, we don't come up with these positions in a vacuum. Basically, there are about 50 Realtor members from throughout the state, from the 16 different local boards. Also, additionally on the committee are the local GADs from throughout the state, from the local boards, along with the local legislative chairs. I just want to do a shout out to our local associations, thank them for all they do. We could not do all of this without your help. The local GADs are great. Like I said, there's 16. There are 6 full-time local GADs and local associations throughout the state, 9 of them that Maryland Realtors provide local GAD assistance. That said, also, we're borrowing one of the local GADs this session to help us with some of our state overview. But we meet weekly on Mondays, and typically, I mean, in the busiest year, it's been about 250 to 300 bills. And there'll be discussion. Obviously, you have to make a motion to support or oppose first, and then we have discussion. And basically, it's very sometimes heated, sometimes easy, but it's typical. What's really good about it is the level of expertise that all our various committee members bring. Some are property managers, some have tax expertise, which really helps us formulate the position that we're going to take. And pretty much, I mean, we try to keep it all to realtor specific bills. We are part of the chamber, so bills that a lot of folks think we should weigh in on, unless it's really realtor related, we try to let the chamber do that, which we are committee participant of. Anything else you can think of, Bill?
No, in fact, I'm going to share my screen at this point. And if you're interested in kind of tracking what our legislative committee looks at, what positions they take, there is an easy way to do that on our website. So let me share my screen real quick. So as some of you will be familiar, this is our website. You would go to our legislative page, and if you zoom on our legislative page, you'll see legislative status report, 2021 legislative status report. You click on that, and that will actually take you to the list of bills that we've reviewed so far. So it's clickable. So if you wanted to get information about a particular bill, including the bill language, you would be able to do that. You would be able to see when the hearing is. You'd be able to click to the hearing itself as well. So there's a lot of information that's up there. I would encourage folks to take a look at it during session. This is updated in real time. So as we add bills every week, it will be updated at that start of the week. So that Monday, or this next week, we're going to be meeting on a Tuesday, but normally by Monday, 5 o'clock, the status report will be updated. I'm going to stop sharing there. Okay. So let's talk about the issues. We know that, legislative session, we're going to completely have a different approach this year because so much of our work is going to be virtual. But we've got a lot of issues that are going to be brought before the legislature, some by us and many by many other groups. I will tell you, for our agenda, we have implemented this year what we call an open doors campaign. And the open doors campaign is really taking a look at a bunch of different housing issues. We know that the undersupply of housing, and I'm sure many of you have seen it in your own markets, where inventory is at a low, in fact, a historic low for the state of Maryland. When you're trying to find property to show buyers, when you're trying to find listings, it's at a historic low. We know that undersupply is driving cost increases. That's locking out a number of people who can get into our market. First-time buyers for the last 4 years have been at also a historic low, about 30% of the market. So we've started this open doors campaign that's really looking at fundamentally expanding the supply of housing across the state. And we think that's fundamental to creating better housing opportunities for all Marylanders, better housing opportunities that actually help our businesses too. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at this year is Bill HB 58. It's going to be a work group on minority home ownership. So some of you are probably familiar with the fact that minority home ownership in our country lags the white home ownership rates by almost 30 points. If you're taking a look at it nationally, it's not quite as bad in Maryland, but we're still talking over a 20 percentage point difference between most people of color and white families in terms of home ownership, despite the fact when we take a look at polling, there's very little difference in terms of the races, in terms of their attitudes on whether they want to be homeowners and how the importance they give to home ownership. So this is a work group that's really taking a look at that. That's going to be focused on that in particular, and what we have to do to expand housing opportunities to make sure that we close some of those home ownership gaps between the races. We think that there are great programs. Some of it's just going to be education, connecting people to the resources that exist. But this work group, which will have realtors on it, at least as the bill is drafted right now, is going to take a look at all of that so that we can figure out, what down payment programs make sense. Do they need to be tweaked? So that's going to be a big bill this year. We're going to look at accessory dwelling units. And Susan, do you want to tell them what an accessory dwelling unit is?
Well, sure. A lot of you may be familiar. I think example probably is the best way to describe it. You may know of the carriage houses attached to some properties. It could be a separate building, or you've heard of the in-law suites. Some folks are referring to them as caretaker suites just that are separate from a property. But a lot of locals have been looking at this initially, and a lot of the rub has been the impact on adequate public facility ordinances and such. But we see a way that we could possibly consider ADUs, as they're well known, just as maybe a conduit to some types of affordable housing.
Yeah, and you know, as Susan mentioned, a lot of counties have, I won't say a lot, but at least several counties have ADU laws on the books. But there's going to be a state bill that really is going to try and set a floor for all of these local laws, because even in some of the counties that permit ADUs, the rules are very restrictive in terms of how the ADU functions, so that you know, it costs a lot to do it. Sometimes you have to dismantle the ADU, that accessory dwelling unit. So let's say you converted a basement into an independent living unit. You would have to dismantle that and make it so that, you know, it doesn't have its own kitchen after that person leaves. So they're just, it's very restrictive. And especially for individuals looking for affordable units, you know, this can help relieve some of that pressure. So there's going to be a big ADU bill that's going to, you know, try to set a floor for a lot of the counties and try and provide more opportunity for homeowners who may want to age in place and bring someone to live in, you know, in their property with them so that they can age in place. Or someone like me who has an adult child who just moved back with them and might need a more independent living place than their own bedroom. So that's what the bill is looking to do. We're also going to take a look at some of the DHCD programs, and I'm going to save a little bit of that to talk about the work group on equity and inclusion, because there's going to be, I think, some pretty exciting bills that the realtors will be interested in that are coming out of that work group this year.
Bill,
yeah.
Just before we moved on, I did want to remind folks, if you want to learn more about the Open Doors campaign, it's opendoorsmaryland.org. Go there, and it gives more detail about the campaign and about the issue, just as far as the housing ownership gap, along with housing supply, the lack thereof. And if you have any stories to share, there's an interactive template petition there where we're getting some of this word back to our legislators, as well as you can share anecdotal stories. So sorry to interrupt, just want to remind them.
Yeah, and in fact, that petition is a petition we're going to share with legislators as well. And we are interested in your stories. You know, one of the things I'll tell you is when we're trying to advocate on behalf of a bill, it's important to tell a story. You know, it's important to tell a legislator why that's important. You know, housing supply. I mean, if you ask, in fact, we did a recent poll and we're going to be releasing the results of it within the next couple of weeks. But if you take a look at Marylanders' attitudes on housing, you know, most Marylanders will tell you, oh, no, we don't think there's really a housing supply issue. But when you start to ask them more detailed questions, they think, well, yeah, there's a big affordable housing supply issue. So it's interesting that, you know, we're not California yet. We're not San Francisco. We're, you know, there's a tremendous homeless population where, you know, a 2-bedroom property is over $1 million. But we're starting to see price appreciation and all these things that really point in the direction of undersupply of housing. So these are all, you know, key factors that we want to remind the legislature about so that they can, you know, make sure that when we're doing planning and implementing programs, we're trying to provide housing for the citizens that are going to be here. The other thing we're going to look at under that Open Doors campaign is affordability of the homestead tax credit. Many of you know that a homestead tax credit is very important for a homeowner. It keeps their property tax payments low because it really restricts how much of their new tax assessment, the local counties can tax on. But sometimes that serves as a great incentive for a homeowner not to move out of their property. And so we have at least one legislator from Prince George's County that's going to be introducing a Prince George's County bill, but we've talked to a couple other legislators who might be looking at some other county bills to create a portable tax credit so that you'd be able to take that tax credit with you from one property and at least for a 5-year period, use it in another property, but target it toward affordable housing units so that we're looking at kind of the lower end priced units, try to free them up. One of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years in the industry is that people are staying in their property longer. And that churn of real estate that opens up a lot of, affordable units isn't happening as often. And that's part of the undersupply problem as well. So we've got some legislators that are interested in pushing some of those portability of the tax credit bills as well. And then moving off of the kind of open doors affordability agenda, we're also looking at property management registration legislation. This was a bill that was passed by the House last year, but the legislative session ended early, so it did not get consideration in the Senate. And it wouldn't change what you as a real estate agent can do as a property manager, but it would say to other folks that don't have a real estate license in the state of Maryland, and mostly for not the big multi-unit buildings, but mostly for folks managing single family properties and small unit buildings, that they have to at least be registered with the Real Estate Commission in order to conduct property management business. That bill is going to come back this year. Doesn't require you, again, as a real estate licensee to also have a registration because you can already do that under your license. But if you don't have a license, you would at least have to have that registration. And then broadband expansion. And maybe, Susan, you can talk a little bit about why that's important.
Sure, happy to. And on the property management, part of the registration too, they wanted to assure folks had a bond. I was just going to touch on that because the Real Estate Commission follows that considerably. And a lot of the complaints at the Real Estate Commission, they tend to be with regard to property management. And as you all know, a lot of property, when the complaints are filed, then sometimes if someone has a license, then they can go against the guarantee fund. So we think there's some inequity there. The first step is part of why we're thinking of, let's start with the registration. On the broadband, it's become even more imperative now, as anyone doing homeschooling with the kids can attest, as well as our working from home. You are at a tremendous disadvantage if you don't have bandwidth. We've all been on the Zoom meetings and such, where all of a sudden someone starts talking and fades out, and you hear half and they're frozen. So we're hopeful we've elevated this to a statewide priority. We used to always support it for the locals. A lot of times our folks out west in Garrett and Southern Maryland have really wanted the state support regarding this issue, but it's been elevated this session because the need is greater now than ever.
Yeah, and we see a lot of reports too, just talking about, what effect that has even on the price of property. I mean, I'm sure many of you have experienced that, looking at property with buyers, they find out there's no, broadband access, and you have buyers that walk away from those properties. So it does have an impact on property values too. But as you know, even with the virtual practice of real estate, there are many people who that's how they've toured a home during this pandemic, is virtually. So it's becoming essential for many, many households. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about a whole host of bills that are going to come in. There was a work group that was established by the Maryland legislature called the Work Group on Equity and Inclusion. And that was looking at a whole host of issues, but taking a look at equity issues and inclusion issues across environmental issues, health, education, and there's a section on it regarding housing. We were approached by a couple of the work group members about our industry and taking a look at equity issues, mostly racial equity issues within the industry and home buying, taking a look, for example, at that very significant and persistent home ownership gap. So that report was just released by the Maryland legislature, and it has a lot of really interesting proposals in it. And I think on the housing front, a lot of things that I think our members should be excited about. The first, kind of foundational statement in that report, at least regarding housing, is what an important role homeownership plays in terms of building generational wealth through home equity. So they really recognize, like all of you do, since you're in this business, how important home ownership is in addressing a lot of the income equity issues and other equity issues within just the industry itself. So what do they propose in terms of doing that moving forward? They're going to look at MMP program, and for many of you will be familiar with the Maryland Mortgage Program. The great thing about the Maryland Mortgage Program is that for many people, you can get down payment assistance. So if you're a person with a lower income, you might be a new buyer, a first-time buyer, these programs will give you some down payment assistance. And we know through polling and other data that cash assistance is one of the top barriers that many people have in terms of getting into housing. In fact, there was a report that was issued showing that there are about over 700,000 minority mortgage ready families. I mean, they can afford, a mortgage payment, but they just have trouble coming up with the cash in order to get into housing. So, I mean, a lot of these down payment programs could have a significant impact in helping to close some of these home ownership gaps. So in addition to trying to supersize that MMP program and provide more assistance to it, they're also looking at increasing the down payment assistance. Typically it's been about $5,000, but making sure that it can be used not just for down payment, but also for closing costs, and increasing it to $10,000. Taking a look at doing more targeted outreach for these programs, making sure that DHCD is working with realtors, making sure that they're getting out and talking to agents and brokers about these programs so that people who could use these programs can actually get hooked up with those resources. So a lot of kind of interesting things that reports proposing things that I think we're going to like. We're waiting to see the actual bill language that comes out from the report. And also expanded financial education, making sure that folks have the appropriate financial education. So we expect to see bills on all of those things, increasing down payment assistance and improving those programs so that more people can actually get access to those programs. Yep.
Question.
Yes.
Did we have any members as part of that work group, or were these just state?
So this work group were all legislators. So it was an all legislator work group appointed by the leaders in the Senate and the House. But they did reach out to lots of different groups, including us. In fact, we had a group of about 8 to 10 realtors who spoke with the actually chairperson of the work group on a whole host of issues related to housing. And so it was good. It was a lot of really good feedback back and forth. And, and it was nice to see some of the things that we talked about actually end up in the final report too. But we also know that in addition to our issues, in addition to the kind of leadership issues on work group on inclusion and equity, there's going to be a bunch of other bills. So one of the things that the legislature is going to be mostly focused on are COVID related bills. I'll kind of breeze through some of that really quickly. You're going to have everything from business loan programs and expanding those. so that those businesses that are still having, difficulty can get the assistance they need, making sure that there's state tax forgiveness. Some of you may have seen that the federal government has approved tax forgiveness for any of the grants that you receive, so you don't get taxed on that grant money that you received. Well, the state's going to do the same thing. There's going to be a bill to permit that. There's going to be COVID-related legislation on giving Marylanders, not all, but low-income Marylanders, financial assistance, the same kinds of checks that the federal government gave out, those direct payment checks. There's going to be a COVID liability limit bill that would apply to businesses. Some people like that. We think when we bring that bill before our legislative committee, they'll like that, but there will be some opposition to that bill moving forward. And then there's going to be a whole host of landlord tenant bills. And there will be a lot of landlord tenant bills that we're going to look at this year. Everything from eviction diversion programs to rent control to right to counsel for for tenants that come before, that are facing a failure to pay rent and have to go to court, to mold. Mold is going to be a big issue this year. And in fact, under the work group report for inclusion, there was a specific recommendation for the Department of Environment to come up with state standards for mold. We know that there have been property owners sued because of mold problems that tenants experienced in their units, and this is looking at trying to come up with some state standards in terms of how that's measured and how people approach that. We've already looked at one mold bill that was very extensive. We think, while I don't think anybody believes that we shouldn't be looking and identifying mold, this bill was pretty significant in terms of all the requirements it had. We did not support that particular bill. We think there are other ways to look at the mold issue that make a lot more sense. And kind of related to COVID, but not necessarily, there's going to be a bunch of tax bills. Susan, you mentioned the tax on service bill. We don't think that's going to be back this year. Last year, after the 600 realtors showed up, we had some pretty direct conversations with, that was a House bill. We had senators tell us pretty directly that that is not going to be an agenda item for the Senate last year, and have also been told this year that it's not an agenda item for the Senate. So we don't expect it to end up on the House agenda either. But there will be tax bills. I don't know at this point which ones are going to move forward, but there will be capital gains bills that are looking to tax properties over $1 million. So it'll be in addition to whatever the federal capital gains taxes are. So an additional 1% tax on some of those property sales in Maryland. And there will be bills just taking a look at income tax exclusions for certain businesses. There will be other tax bills taxing higher earning Marylanders, their incomes. So we're going to see a bunch of bills like that on the tax front. And then there's going to be a whole host of just different kind of real estate bills that just, they don't come under any particular category. There will be a disclosure bill that we know about that would require real estate contracts in Maryland to talk about zones of dewatering influence. So it would be a buyer notice that would end up in our contract. For those of you that don't know what a zone of dewatering influence is, we're talking about sinkholes. So there are 4 counties in the state of Maryland, Baltimore, Carroll, Frederick, and Washington County, that have all been classified as dewatering zones. So different areas of those counties have been classified as dewatering zones, and thus more subject to a sinkhole. There's all kinds of property insurance you can get to protect your property and yourself from a sinkhole. So the idea was to make sure that buyers are aware of that. They can go up to the state, take a look at a map, see if a property falls within a dewatering zone, at least so that they know, maybe they should be thinking about some of that insurance if they move forward with a property purchase. There's going to be legislation on climate change. There's going to be a very aggressive climate change bill, and it's going to be pretty aggressive in terms of what it is going to require for a lot of buildings. Most of it is focused on commercial buildings, but it's going to be looking at 40% reductions in that energy output that those commercial buildings put out, annual 40% reductions. So it's pretty significant. The bill contemplates exemptions from having to comply with some of those climate control issues for those commercial buildings if it's going to take more than 15 years to recover the costs of doing those energy saving changes in the building. But as you can see, if it costs 15 years to recover those initial costs are going to be quite high. And, particularly for a commercial market that we know is very weak right now, given the pandemic, we've got a lot of concerns about that bill too. I'm going to end it right there. See, Dan, or do we have some questions?
Yes, we have one at this point.
Okay.
It's a suggestion.
All right.
I'll read it to you. It suggests that Maryland Realtors reach out to property management committees in the counties, as well as get the assistance of property management community on its committee.
That is a good suggestion, and one we have already taken that advice. In fact, we have a number of property managers that sit on our legislative committee. We've formed a little work group on all of these landlord tenant bills, and we've also reached outside of our legislative committee to pull in a couple of property managers as well. So we've got a little working group that's going to be taking a look at all of these landlord tenant bills. I mean, I mentioned just, the rent control, the eviction diversion, but there are a lot more bills than just that. So they're all going to require, us taking a look at that, seeing what makes sense, seeing what is just, what is unworkable, what is onerous, and trying to move forward with that. And we've got our first meeting actually is it Friday, Susan? Is it this week?
Yes, with the LT work group.
Yep. So we're going to be reviewing some of the initial bills that have been dropped, but also trying to plan ahead for some of the bills that we're expecting to come in, so that we can see. And plus, I will let you know too, Susan and I reach out with a lot of different groups. We're not the only real estate group in Annapolis that is, advocating for housing bills. There are commercial real estate groups. There are other residential multi-unit rental groups out there. So there are lots of different groups related to housing. So we talk to them pretty often. I was in fact on a conference call today on the climate bill with a bunch of different housing groups about that. So yeah, that's a great suggestion and one we are following through with right now.
That is the only question we have at this moment.
Great. Well, I'm going to, a couple of things I'm going to say this, just to kind of wrap things up is definitely if you're interested in some of these issues, and in particular, if you're interested in what, kind of legislation gets passed, always go to the MD Realtor site. It's also going to be on all our social media in terms of the summaries of the bills that go through. But if you at least go to the mdrealtor.org site, you're going to be able to follow those kind of status reports that we provide, what positions we're taking on those bills. And again, those positions are, the result of our input from realtors from across the state. The other thing I would, again, stress to you is while we expect the legislative session to be 90 days, I will tell you there is not a single person in Maryland that's going to bet more than 25 cents on that right now. We still see COVID numbers rising in this state, across the country. So and even though they have a number of different protocols in place this year, in fact, if you actually go to the floor of the Senate this year, it looks like, for those of us that are old enough to remember what a telephone booth looks like, all of the Senate desks look like telephone booths. They are completely encapsulated in order to prevent, the spread of COVID amongst members so that they can try and get through the 90-day session. The House, unfortunately, because there are 141 delegates, there's just too many people to do that on the House floor. The quarters are too tight there. They're actually splitting it up. There are now going to be 2 floors for the House of Delegates. One is going to be in the House of Delegates building. About 70 members are going to be over there, and then 71 members are going to be in the State House on the House floor there. So lots of different changes to how to the protocol moving forward. But we'll be giving updates on new issues that come in, and just continue to follow up on our status reports. I want to thank everybody for coming today. Susan, anything to add?
So actually, it might be a good moment just to remind everyone, just as far as the virtual CE, we've been in touch with the commission. In addition to the legislature, we track all of the real estate commission hearing or meetings. And just last week, we met with the chair of the commissioners along with the executive director. They've been working through the pandemic like us, just trying to pivot. I know some folks have expressed a little bit of difficulty in trying to reach them. I think the phone system has been, it hasn't adapted as well. So email is the best way to reach out to the commission. But please be sure to stay up on your CE. The license expiration, as you know, is they've said 30 days from the lift of the state of emergency to get that done. As you know, we've worked hard throughout this past summer, or spring and summer and fall, with regard to getting virtual CE so that you all can take your classes. Just an interesting note from January till about November, December, salespersons, brokers, those numbers have continued to increase, nearly over 3,000 salespersons and brokers. So folks are looking to real estate as well, just as an opportunity, because they've been able to continue work.
Great. Well, again, everybody, thanks for tuning in. And definitely, if you ever have a question on a legislative issue, feel free to reach out to Susan and I. You can get all of our contact information on mdrealtor.org. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Happy New
Bill.
Year.